For 22 years, my parents called me the burden, while my sister was their golden child. They said it quietly at home. They said it during family dinners. They said it so often that eventually I believed them. But at our last family reunion, my father made a mistake. He said those words out loud in front of everyone. And that's when I pressed play on a recording they never thought anyone would hear. By minute 7, my sister ran out of the room. And my parents finally realized that the truth they had hidden for decades was now playing through the speakers. For 22 years, my parents called me the burden, not in secret, not in whispers when they thought I couldn't hear. They said it openly, casually, like it was just another fact about me, like saying the sky was blue, or that winter always comes after fall, or that my sister was perfect. And for most of my life, I believed them. I believed I was the weight that dragged my family down, the child they regretted having, the daughter who made everything harder. But what my parents didn't know, and what my sister never imagined, was that one day in front of our entire extended family, I would press play on a recording, and every lie they told about me would collapse in less than 7 minutes. But to understand that moment, you have to understand the house I grew up in. Because some homes are loud, some families fight, argue, and make up again. Mine was different. In my house, silence was safer than speaking. I learned that very early. My name is Charlotte. I'm 27 years old now, but the story really begins when I was just a little girl trying to understand why it felt like I was always in the wrong place. Our house looked perfect from the outside. The lawn was always trimmed neatly, the driveway clean, the curtains bright white. Neighbors loved to say how lucky my parents were, 2 daughters, a beautiful home. But inside that house, something was always off. Not loud enough to be called abuse. Not obvious enough for outsiders to notice. Just a quiet feeling that I never quite belonged there. My earliest memories are strange ones. Not birthday parties or toys, but small expressions on my parents' faces. The way my mother sighed when teachers praised me. The way my father frowned slightly when I entered the room. It took me years to understand those moments. Back then, I just thought I must be doing something wrong. My sister Olivia never had that problem. She was 3 years older than me, and from the moment she could talk, people adored her. She was confident, outgoing, bright and loud in a way that made everyone notice her. Teachers loved her. Neighbors complimented her constantly. Maiders complimented her constantly. Relatives talked about her like she was destined for something extraordinary. But the people who admired her most were my parents. When Olivia walked into a room, everything changed. My mother's face softened. My father smiled in a way I almost never saw directed at me. They listened to her stories. They laughed at her jokes. They praised her constantly. Olivia is going to go far in life. She's our miracle. That girl is something special. I heard those words many times growing up, just never about me. When I walked into the same room, the reaction was quieter, more neutral. Oh, my father might say, "You're home?" Not a question, just a statement. Like noticing a lamp had been turned on. I remember once bringing home a drawing from school. I must have been about 5 years old. It was a picture of our family. 4 stick figures. Mom. I had colored everything carefully. Bright yellow sun. Blue sky, green grass. I ran into the kitchen, excited to show my mother. She glanced at the drawing for a few seconds. Then she sighed. A long, tired sigh. "Charlotte," she said, rubbing her temple. "Why did you draw your sister so small?" I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the paper. "Olivia should be the center. She's the older one." Then she handed the drawing back like it was something unfinished. Something wrong. I remember staring down at that paper for a long time. Even at 5 years old, I felt something strange in my chest, like I had misunderstood my own family somehow. Like the picture I drew wasn't accurate, because in our house, Olivia was always the center, and I was always somewhere at the edge. The first time I heard the word burden, I was 8 years old. It was late evening. The house was quiet except for the television playing softly in the living room. I had gotten out of bed to get a glass of water. As I walked down the hallway, I heard my parents talking. Their voices sounded serious. I wasn't trying to listen, but the hallway carried sound easily. Then my father said something that made me freeze in place. Then my father said something that made me freeze in place. She's becoming a burden. The words landed so suddenly that I stopped breathing. My mother sighed. I know, she said quietly. My stomach tightened. I knew instantly who they were talking about. There was a pause before my father spoke again. Olivia has potential. She's confident. She'll make something of herself. Another pause. But Charlotte, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to it. My mother spoke after a moment. We'll just have to deal with it. Boats. We'll just have to deal with it. Deal with it. Like I was a problem. A responsibility. Something inconvenient. I stood in the hallway holding the wall so tightly my fingers hurt. At 8 years old, you don't fully understand words like that, but you understand the feeling behind them. And the feeling was clear. I wasn't something they were proud of. I was something they tolerated. That night I went back to my room quietly. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because a small part of me believed something even worse. Maybe they were right. After that night, I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. Little patterns. The way my parents celebrated Olivia's achievements loudly and acknowledged mine quietly. If Olivia brought home a B on a test, it became a long discussion about how school was challenging. If I brought home an A, my father simply nodded. That's expected. If Olivia forgot to do chores, my mother laughed it off. She's busy. But if I forgot something small, the reaction was sharp. You are becoming more trouble than you're worth. Those words added up over time, each one reinforcing the same message: burden, burden, burden. By the time I was 12, the word wasn't just something my parents said, it had become something I believed about myself. So I started trying to fix it. I studied harder than anyone in my class. I stayed late after school. I finished assignments days early. Not because I loved studying, but because I thought maybe success would change how they saw me. Maybe if I worked hard enough, one day my father would say something different. Maybe he would look at me the way he looked at Olivia, with pride. But that moment never came. Instead, something else happened. The more effort I put in, the more invisible my achievements seemed to become. Family gatherings made it even worse. Those events followed the same pattern every time. Relatives gathered around Olivia first. How is school going? Are you still playing sports? You're getting so beautiful. My sister loved those moments. She told stories loudly. She laughed confidently. She soaked up attention like sunlight. Meanwhile, I usually stood quietly near the kitchen, helping clear dishes. Sometimes an aunt or uncle would notice me. "Oh, Charlotte," someone might say, "you should be more like your sister." She's so outgoing, my parents never corrected those comments. In fact, sometimes they agreed. She's always been the easier one, my mother once said during a holiday dinner. Easier, not better, just easier. I remember an uncle joking once during a barbecue, "Well, every family has a problem child." People laughed. And my father didn't argue. He just looked at me. That glance said everything. By the time I became a teenager, that label had settled deep inside my mind. Burden. I carried it everywhere. Every decision. Every mistake. Every quiet moment alone. If something went wrong, I blamed myself immediately. Because deep down, I believed I deserved it. But what I didn't realize back then was that every cruel comment, every dismissive laugh, every moment my parents thought no one else could hear them, was quietly building something else. Not just pain, not just resentment, evidence. Evidence that would one day change everything. And when the time finally came, the people who called me the burden for 22 years would be the ones left speechless. By the time I turned 16, the word burden had settled deep inside my mind like a quiet shadow that followed me everywhere. I didn't hear my parents say it every day, but I didn't need to. Once you hear something enough times, it becomes the voice inside your own head. And mine repeated the same message constantly: don't take up too much space. Don't ask for too much. Don't give them another reason to regret you. So I made a promise to myself when I was 16. If my parents believed I was a burden, then I would do everything possible to become the opposite. I started working harder than anyone around me. At school, I took the toughest classes available. Not because I loved them, but because I thought effort might change how my parents saw me. I stayed up late studying while the rest of the house slept. Sometimes until 2 in the morning, sometimes until my eyes burned so badly I had to press my palms against them just to keep reading. The next morning, I would wake up exhausted, get dressed quietly, and leave for school before anyone else even noticed I was gone. At dinner, if my parents asked about my day, I gave short answers. Not because I didn't want to talk, but because experience had taught me something important. Talking too much only reminded them that I existed, and existing in their eyes always seemed to come with a cost. Meanwhile, Olivia lived a completely different life inside the same house. She went out with friends constantly. Sometimes she came home after midnight. Sometimes she skipped classes entirely. My parents rarely said anything. If I ever mentioned it, my mother waved it away. Your sister is exploring life, she would say. She needs freedom to find herself. I remember standing there once, listening to that explanation while holding a report card filled with perfect grades. And I realized something painful. Freedom wasn't something I was allowed to have. Freedom was reserved for the golden child. When I turned 17, I got my first part-time job. It was at a small grocery store 3 blocks from school. The pay wasn't great, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the money was mine. I worked evenings stocking shelves, organizing products, and helping customers find things they couldn't locate. It was simple work, but something about that job felt peaceful. The manager thanked me when I finished tasks. Customers smiled when I helped them. For the first time in a long time, I was in a place where my presence wasn't treated like an inconvenience. When I brought home my first paycheck, I showed it to my father. I thought maybe, just maybe, he would be proud. Instead, he barely looked at it. Well, he said flatly, at least you're finally contributing something. The words stung more than I expected. But I nodded quietly and walked away, because by then disappointment was something I had learned to carry without showing it. Around that same time, Olivia decided college wasn't for her. At least, that's what she said the first time. She enrolled in a program my parents paid for. 3 months later, she dropped out. My parents didn't get angry. They didn't criticize her. They simply told relatives that Olivia was taking time to find her passion. A year later, she enrolled again. Another program, another opportunity, and once again, she left halfway through. This time, my parents paid for a completely different school, a different program, a different city. And they told everyone how proud they were that Olivia was brave enough to follow her dreams. Meanwhile, I was filling out college applications with shaking hands, because even though I had good grades, I knew something important. My parents weren't planning to help me. So I searched for scholarships, every single one I could find. I spent weeks writing essays, late nights sitting at my small desk, typing and rewriting the same paragraphs over and over, trying to explain my goals, trying to explain my determination, trying to explain why someone should believe in me, even if my own parents didn't. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. My hands were shaking. Inside was a message that changed everything. I had been accepted. Not with a full scholarship, but with enough financial help that I could afford the rest if I worked hard enough. For the first time in years, I felt something close to hope. That evening, I showed the letter to my father. He read it slowly. Then he placed it on the kitchen table. Just make sure you don't embarrass the family by failing. Failing, he said. That was the entire conversation. No congratulations. No pride, just a warning. College became my escape, not because it was easy, but because it was easy, but because it was different. For the first time in my life, people didn't know me as the quiet girl from the corner of the house. They just knew me as Charlotte. And that difference mattered more than I expected. Professors encouraged my work. Classmates invited me to study groups. Some even called me smart. That word felt strange at first, not because I didn't understand it, but because I had never heard it directed at me before. I worked constantly, classes during the day, a job in the evenings, sometimes another shift on weekends. Money was always tight, but every paycheck meant something important. Independence. Meanwhile, back home, Olivia's life continued. The the way it always had. My parents still supported her financially, still defended her decisions, still told everyone she was destined for greatness. Still told everyone she was destined for greatness. Whenever I visited during holidays, the same pattern repeated. My achievements were acknowledged politely. But Olivia's stories dominated every conversation. Even when those stories involved failure, somehow, her mistakes were always described as courage, and my successes were treated like obligations. During my second year of college, something unexpected happened. It started on a random evening while I was sitting alone in my dorm room. I had been feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, carrying the same quiet weight I had carried since childhood. So I did something strange. I opened the voice recorder on my phone, and I started talking. Not to anyone, just to myself. At first it felt awkward, but after a few minutes the words began to flow. I talked about my childhood, about the word burden, about the way my parents looked at Olivia, about the way they avoided looking at me. That recording lasted almost 40 minutes. When it ended, I felt lighter, like I had finally said things out loud that had lived inside my head for years. So I kept doing it. Every time something bothered me, every time a memory resurfaced, every time I felt that old familiar sadness creeping in, I recorded another voice note. They became a private archive of my thoughts, a way to keep myself sane. I never planned for anyone else to hear them. They were just mine. But over time, something unexpected happened. Sometimes when I visited home, I accidentally recorded more than my own thoughts. Because there were moments when I set my phone down on the table, forgot the recorder was still running, and captured conversations my parents never thought anyone would hear. At the time, I didn't think much about it. They were just recordings. Random moments, pieces of sound. But years later, those small accidental recordings would become something much bigger, something powerful, something my parents never imagined could exist. By the time I graduated college, I had saved enough money to move out completely. I packed my belongings quietly. A few boxes, some books, clothes, memories I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. When I carried the last box to the door, my mother glanced at it. "Make sure you take everything," she said. "I don't want your things cluttering the house." My father didn't hug me. He didn't wish me luck. He simply nodded once and returned to reading the newspaper. Olivia wasn't even home. She was out celebrating something with friends. As I drove away that day, I looked back at the house in the rearview mirror, and I realized something strange. For the first time in 22 years, I felt a little lighter. I thought leaving would be the end of the story. I thought distance would finally give me peace. But life has a way of bringing unfinished things back. Because 3 years later, an invitation arrived, a big family reunion. Relatives from all over the country were flying in. My parents wanted everyone there, even me. At first, I considered ignoring the message completely, but something inside me hesitated. Because deep down, a small part of me still wondered if things could change. If maybe, after all these years, my parents might finally see me differently. What I didn't know yet was that reunion would become the night everything collapsed, the night the truth would finally leave the shadows, and the night the word burden would stop belonging to me forever. 3 years passed after I moved out of my parents' house. 3 quiet, peaceful years where my life finally felt like it belonged to me. I built routines that had nothing to do with their expectations. Morning coffee before work, late evening walks through the small park near my apartment, weekends spent reading, cleaning, or sometimes just sitting in silence without feeling judged for it. For the first time in my life, silence didn't feel heavy. I worked at a small marketing company then, nothing glamorous. But every paycheck, every project, every small success reminded me that I was capable of building something on my own. Without my parents, without Olivia, without the constant reminder that I was somehow less than everyone else, I kept minimal contact with my family. Occasional texts from my mother asking short questions, sometimes a holiday message. My father rarely reached out, and Olivia only contacted me when she needed something. Money advice, a ride somewhere, help filling out forms she didn't want to deal with. Our conversations were always brief, surface level, polite but distant, and honestly, that distance felt safe. For a long time, I thought that was how things would stay quiet, separate, uncomplicated, until one evening, an email arrived that changed everything. The subject line read, "My mother, apparently reunion. You better be there." It was from my mother. Apparently, my parents had decided to organize a massive family gathering. Relatives from all over the country were invited uncles, aunts, cousins I hadn't seen in years, even some distant relatives I barely remembered. They had rented a large event hall, decorations, catering, speeches planned. According to the message, it was supposed to celebrate family history, achievements, and the future. The email ended with a short sentence. Everyone expects both daughters to attend. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely. Delete the message, pretend I never saw it. Because deep down, I knew exactly how these gatherings usually went. Olivia in the spotlight. My parents glowing with pride beside her. And me? Somewhere near the back of the room, quietly blending into the background. But something inside me hesitated. Not hope. Not exactly. More like unfinished business. 22 years of being called a burden doesn't just disappear when you move out. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice wondered something I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. What if this time was different? What if time had changed them? People grow older. Sometimes they grow wiser. Maybe, just maybe, my parents had realized the way they treated me wasn't fair. Maybe they wanted to fix things. Maybe that reunion was their way of reaching out. Looking back now, that thought feels almost naive. But at the time, it felt possible. So after 2 days of thinking about it, I replied with a short message, "I'll be there." The reunion was scheduled for a Saturday evening. The event hall was about 40 minutes from my apartment. On the drive there, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: nervousness, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. Memories kept drifting through my mind during the drive. Family dinners, holiday arguments, the word burden echoing quietly in the back of my head. I tried to shake those thoughts away. This was supposed to be a celebration. Maybe things would finally feel different. When I arrived, the parking lot was already full. Cars lined the sides of the road. Through the large glass windows of the hall, I could see bright lights and moving figures. The place looked lively, loud, busy. I took a deep breath before stepping inside. The moment the doors opened, the sound of voices rushed toward me. Dozens of relatives talking at once. Laughter, clinking glasses, music playing softly in the background. The room was decorated with long tables, white lights, and large photo displays showing old family pictures. I recognized some faces immediately. Others took a few seconds. A few relatives waved politely when they saw me. Some smiled. Some looked slightly surprised, but no one seemed particularly interested in my arrival, which was normal. I stepped further into the room, and then I saw them. My parents stood near the center of the hall, greeting guests. My father wore a suit, smiling broadly, as he shook hands and told stories. My mother stood beside him, laughing politely and pointing toward something across the room. And right next to them was Olivia. She looked exactly the way she always did at family gatherings: confident, radiant, completely comfortable being the center of attention. People surrounded her in a loose circle, listening as she spoke. Every few seconds, someone laughed loudly at something she said. She was wearing a bright red dress that seemed designed to attract attention. And it worked. Even from across the room, it was impossible not to notice her. For a moment, I stood near the entrance watching the scene. Nothing had changed. Not really. It felt exactly like every other gathering from my childhood. Olivia in the spotlight, my parents proud beside her, and me, on the outside. Eventually, I found an empty chair near the back of the hall. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it was far enough away that I could observe without being part of the center crowd. A waiter walked by and offered drinks. I took a glass of water and sat quietly, watching the room fill up. More relatives arrived. More. Conversations started. Every now and then, someone approached me to say hello. Short, polite exchanges. "How have you been?" Their attention always drifted back toward the center of the room, toward Olivia. After dinner was served and people finished eating, someone tapped a spoon against a glass. The sound echoed lightly through the hall. Gradually, conversations quieted. Chairs turned toward the small stage at the front. My father stepped forward holding a microphone. I felt a small knot tighten in my stomach. Public speaking was something he always enjoyed. He cleared his throat and smiled warmly at the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. His voice carried easily across the room. He started talking about family history, about traditions, about how important it was for relatives to stay connected, even as life moved people farther apart. People nodded politely. A few clapped softly at certain points. Then his speech shifted. He began talking about the future, about the next generation, about pride, and of course, he said, smiling wider, every family has someone who makes them proud. His hand gestured toward Olivia. She smiled brightly. The crowd responded with warm applause. My father continued speaking, his voice confident and steady. "I'm proud to say we have a daughter who truly represents the best of our family." More applause. I stared down at my glass of water. Something inside me already knew where this was going, but a small part of me hoped I was wrong. Then my father said the sentence that shattered whatever fragile hope I had left. "We only have one daughter we're proud of." The words echoed through the room, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. The silence in the room lasted only a few seconds, but for me, it felt like time had stopped completely. My father stood at the front of the hall, holding the microphone, smiling like he had just told a harmless joke. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Some glanced toward me, others looked down at their plates. And then my sister laughed. Not the kind of laugh someone gives when they feel uncomfortable. Not the kind people use when they're trying to soften an awkward moment. No. Olivia laughed like it was genuinely funny, like the whole room was supposed to laugh with her. That sound traveled across the hall and settled somewhere deep in my chest. For a long moment, I didn't move. I simply sat there, staring at the glass in my hands. The same sentence repeated in my mind again and again. And again. "We only have one daughter we're proud of." He hadn't even tried to hide it. Not tonight. Not in front of dozens of relatives. After 22 years of whispers and quiet comments behind closed doors, they had finally said it out loud. In public. And a room full of people, and strangely enough, the pain I expected never arrived, not in the way I imagined. There were no tears, no sudden rush of anger. Instead, something inside me felt calm, like a door had quietly closed. Because in that moment, I realized something important. For years, I had tried to prove them wrong, tried to earn approval they never intended to give, tried to become someone worthy of being treated like their daughter. But standing there in that hall, listening to my father proudly erase me in front of everyone, I finally understood there was nothing left to prove. The truth had already been decided in their minds a long time ago, and suddenly I felt lighter. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I no longer needed their approval. Around the room, whispers had begun spreading between relatives. Some looked uncomfortable, some looked shocked. A few stared openly at my parents as if trying to understand whether they had really heard the words correctly. My father continued speaking, completely unaware that the atmosphere in the room had changed. He went on about Olivia's potential, about how proud he was of the woman she had become, about how the future of our family looked bright because of her. Olivia stood beside the stage smiling, accepting the praise like it was the most natural thing in the world. I glanced around the hall. A few relatives met my eyes, quickly, then looked away. Not one person said anything, and that silence, that familiar silence, told me everything. It was the same silence I had grown up with. The same silence that allowed those words to exist for 22 years. The same silence that protected the story my parents wanted everyone to believe. But something was different tonight, because this time, I wasn't the quiet girl in the corner anymore. I had spent years recording my thoughts on my phone. Little voice notes, private conversations with myself when the weight of my childhood memories became too heavy. But those recordings weren't the only things on my phone. Over time, something else had been captured. Moments when I visited home and forgot the recorder was still running. Conversations my parents had when they believed no one was listening. complaints, insults, discussions about how disappointing I was, about how Olivia was the only child worth bragging about. At the time, those recordings had meant nothing, just accidental pieces of sound saved in a folder I rarely opened. But tonight, those recordings suddenly meant everything. I slowly placed my glass on the table. My heart began beating faster, though my face stayed calm. My father was finishing his speech. People clapped politely. The sound echoed lightly through the hall. And in that moment, I made a decision that surprised even me. For 22 years, I had carried the word burden quietly. I had protected my parents' image. I had allowed them to control the story of our family. But tonight, they had told the truth in front of everyone, or at least part of it. Now it was time for the rest. I stood up slowly from my chair. At first, no one noticed. Most of the room was still focused on my father stepping away from the microphone. But as I began walking toward the front of the hall, conversation started to fade. The sound of my shoes against the floor echoed softly in the quiet room. My father noticed me first, his eyebrows pulled together in confusion, then irritation, as if I were interrupting something important. My mother turned next. Her expression changed instantly. Concern, not for me, but for the situation. Olivia noticed last. She rolled her eyes slightly when she saw me approaching, still smiling. Approaching, still smiling, still convinced that whatever I was about to do would simply be another awkward moment she could laugh off. I reached the stage. The microphone stood on the small table beside the projector system that had been used earlier for family photos. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice remained steady. Since we're talking about family pride tonight, I said calmly, I think everyone deserves to hear the whole story. The room fell completely silent. You could feel the tension shift instantly. My father stepped forward. Charlotte, he said sharply, this isn't the time. But I didn't look at him. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My mother's face went pale. She must have sensed something. Because she moved quickly toward the stage. What are you doing? She whispered urgently. I connected my phone to the projector cable. The large screen behind us flickered to life. My father's irritation turned into anger. Turn that off, he said quietly. But his voice no longer sounded confident, because the room was watching now. Everyone. I scrolled through my phone for a moment. Found the folder. The one filled with recordings I had barely thought about for years. Then I pressed play. At first, there was only static. A soft crackling sound from the speakers. People shifted slightly in their chairs, confused, curious. Then a voice filled the hall, my father's voice. Clear, sharp. She's a burden. A wave of shock moved through the room instantly. Gasps, whispers. My mother froze beside the stage, my father's face drained of color. The recording continued. My mother's voice followed, complaining about how difficult I was, how embarrassing it was when people compared me to Olivia, how they wished things had turned out differently. Every word echoed through the speakers, every sentence undeniable. The projector displayed timestamps beside the audio files, dates, years, proof that these conversations weren't taken out of context, proof that this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was history, real, recorded, and impossible to deny. I didn't look at anyone while the recordings played, not my parents, not Olivia, not the shocked faces filling the room. I simply stood there and let the truth speak for itself. Because after 22 years of silence, the story was finally being told out loud. The first recording ended, but the silence that followed it felt louder than the audio itself. No one in the hall moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the projector behind me. I finally lifted my eyes from the floor and looked out at the room. Dozens of relatives were staring at the stage. Some with shock, some with anger, some with the kind of uncomfortable realization that comes when a truth you ignored for years is suddenly impossible to deny. My father stood frozen near the microphone. His confident posture from earlier had disappeared. His shoulders looked smaller now. His face pale. My mother's hand was still resting on the edge of the table beside the projector, but she didn't try to stop anything anymore. She just stared at the screen like someone watching a nightmare unfold. And Olivia looked completely different than she had 10 minutes earlier. The bright confidence that usually surrounded her had cracked. Her smile was gone. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for someone. Anyone to react the way they always had before. But no one laughed. No one defended her. No one applauded. Because the next recording started playing. My father's voice filled the hall again. "She'll never amount to much," he said in the clip. "You can already see it." A quiet gasp moved through the crowd. Someone whispered my name. Another recording followed immediately after. My mother this time. I don't understand how two daughters from the same house can turn out so differently. Her voice sounded frustrated. "Olivia shines, and Charlotte just drags everything down." Every word echoed through the speakers, and every second made the atmosphere heavier. I didn't interrupt the recordings. I didn't speak. I didn't react. I just let them play. Because the truth didn't need my help anymore. The truth was loud enough on its own. A few seconds later, someone stood up from one of the tables. It was my uncle, my father's older brother. He looked at my parents with an expression I had never seen before. Disappointment. Real, deep disappointment. "How long?" he asked quietly. My father didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. Another relative spoke from across the room. "A big ass cated ponchit the room." Another relative spoke from across the room. Everyone had heard the voices clearly. Everyone knew exactly who they belonged to. Another recording played. This one was older, the audio slightly distorted, but the words were still clear. "Olivia is the only daughter worth bragging about." My father again. My mother agreeing quietly in the background. At that moment, Olivia suddenly stood up from her chair. The movement was quick, sharp. Her chair scraped loudly across the floor. All eyes turned toward her. For a brief second, she looked directly at me. There was anger in her eyes. But something else too. Fear. Not fear of me, fear of the truth. Without saying a single word, she turned and pushed through the crowd toward the exit. Her red dress disappeared between the rows of chairs as she hurried toward the door. No one stopped her. No one followed. The door slammed behind her with a loud echo. But the recordings continued. My mother suddenly stepped forward again, panic rising in her voice. "Turn it off," she said. "This is ridiculous." She reached toward the projector cable, but before she could touch it, someone stepped between us. My uncle. He shook his head slowly. "Let it finish," he said firmly. My mother froze. The room stayed silent. My mother froze. The room stayed silent, and the final recording played. It was one of the last ones I had accidentally captured years earlier. My father's voice sounded tired, frustrated. "I don't know why she tries so hard," he said. "It doesn't matter what she does. She'll always be the burden." The audio ended. The screen behind me went dark. And for the first time that night, there was no sound at all. Not a whisper, not a cough, just the quiet weight of truth settling over the room. I took a slow breath and stepped toward the microphone. My hands were trembling slightly now, but my voice came out steady. "For 22 years," I said, looking around the room, "I was told I was a burden." A few relatives lowered their heads. Others watched me carefully. "I believed it," I continued. "I believed I had to work harder, be quieter, take up less space, just to deserve being part of this family." I paused for a moment. My father still hadn't looked up. My mother's eyes were filled with tears. Not the kind of tears that come from regret, but the kind that come from exposure. "Tonight," I said softly. "You all heard what I heard growing up." I gestured toward the projector behind me. That wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't one argument taken out of context. My voice grew steadier. That was 22 years of truth. A few murmurs spread through the room. People shifting in their seats, processing everything they had just witnessed. I looked at my parents one last time. "Being called a burden doesn't make someone one," I said. "Carrying silence does." Though no one interrupted. No one argued. For the first time in my entire life, my parents had nothing to say. I stepped away from the microphone. No dramatic music played. No shouting followed. No one tried to stop me. I simply walked down from the stage, Across the hall, past the rows of relatives who had watched the entire story unfold. Some of them whispered apologies as I passed. Some just nodded quietly. Others avoided my eyes entirely. But I didn't stop to speak with anyone. I had already said everything that mattered. When I reached the exit doors, I pushed them open and stepped outside. The cool night air hit my face immediately. For a moment, I just stood there breathing. The parking lot was quiet. The noise from the hall barely reached outside, and something inside my chest felt different. Lighter. For 22 years, I had carried a word that didn't belong to me, a label someone else created, a story someone else controlled. But tonight, that story had finally been told the way it actually happened, not through whispers, not through silence, but through truth. In the weeks that followed, things changed in ways I never expected. Relatives began contacting me. Some apologized for not noticing what had been happening all those years. Others admitted they had suspected something, but never wanted to get involved. A few thanked me for saying what no one else had the courage to say. My parents tried calling several times, messages, voicemails, long explanations about how things had been misunderstood, but the recording still existed, and the truth doesn't disappear once people hear it, so I didn't respond. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval anymore. Sometimes people spend their entire lives trying to prove they are worthy of love, trying to fix a story someone else wrote about them. But what I learned that night is something much simpler. You are not defined by the names people give you, not by the labels they repeat, not by the expectations they place on you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop carrying a weight that was never yours to begin with. And when you finally set that weight down, everything changes.